How was the persecution of Christians during the Roman Empire? Beloved brothers, to understand why Rome decided to persecute Christians with such cruelty, we must understand what it meant to be Roman in the first century. The empire was not sustained only by the legions, but also by the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. It was believed that Rome prospered because its gods were satisfied. Sacrifice, ritual, and religious obedience were not personal options, but civic duties. At the top of this system was the emperor, the Pontifex Maximus. Worshipping Caesar was not necessarily an act of spiritual faith, but an oath of political loyalty. Refusing to burn a pinch of incense before the statue of the emperor was equivalent to high treason. When Christianity began to expand through the humble neighborhoods of Rome, authorities quickly classified it as an external and illicit superstitio. Unlike Judaism, which Rome respected for being an ancient and national religion, Christianity was seen as an ideological virus that crossed borders and social classes. For Roman society, Christians were deeply suspicious and often detestable figures for three main reasons. In the first place was the so-called Christian atheism. It sounds contradictory, but Romans called Christians atheists because they denied the existence of visible gods and the state. By not participating in religious festivals, they were accused of drawing the wrath of the gods upon the empire, causing plagues, famines, or military defeats. In the second place, they were attributed with hatred of the human race. The historian Tacitus wrote that Christians were guilty of odium humani generis. This was because Christians withdrew from public spectacles, the theater, and Roman social life, which they considered sinful. Their withdrawal was interpreted as an antisocial rejection of the community. In the third place, many slanders and misunderstandings circulated about them. Because their meetings were private, popular rumor accused them of atrocious rites. When talking about eating the body and drinking the blood, the Eucharist, the Romans, who did not understand the symbolism, accused them of cannibalism. By calling each other brothers and sisters and showing affection, rumors of immorality spread. For a Roman governor, the case of a Christian was an irritating administrative problem. Rome was by nature pragmatic. The empire did not wish to waste resources on mass executions if it could avoid them. Therefore, the trial did not begin with a sentence, but with a negotiation. The magistrate operated under a simple premise: the supremacy of the state. When a Christian was brought to court, the judge was not interested in their theology, but in their obedience. The process followed a three-step protocol designed so that the accused would have every opportunity to save their life in exchange for their integrity. In the first place, the interrogation and the invitation to sanity. The judge usually began with a paternalistic or condescending tone. The Christian was told, "Have mercy on your youth or consider your gray hair and your family." For the Roman, the refusal to sacrifice was seen as a transitory madness, a mindless fanaticism that was not worth death. They were offered the easiest way out: the sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. This consisted simply of taking a few grains of incense and letting them fall onto a lit brazier in front of a statue of Caesar. They were not asked to abandon their beliefs in private, but to perform a public act of political loyalty. For Rome, if you burned incense, you could believe in whatever you wanted afterward. You had recognized that Caesar was the supreme lord. In the second place, the conflict of contumacy, stubborn obstinacy. When the Christian uttered the phrase Christianus sum, "I am a Christian," the tone of the trial changed. For Roman law, this phrase was not just a confession of faith. It was a declaration of contumacy. Contumacy was the persistent and defiant resistance to legal authority. In the Roman code, once a judge gave a direct order to sacrifice, and the accused refused 3 times. The crime was no longer Christianity itself, but the defiance of the magistrate. The state could not allow an individual to decide which laws to obey and which not to. At that moment, execution became necessary not to punish a religion, but to protect the majesty of imperial law. In the third place, the libellus and apostasy, the triumph that Rome sought. What the governor really desired was to obtain a libellus. The libellus was an official certificate proving that the individual had sacrificed to the gods and sworn by the emperor. A Christian who agreed to sacrifice was a political trophy. It was proof that the Roman system could bend the will of dissenters. For this reason, many judges extended trials for days. They used torture not to kill, but to help the accused change their mind. Rome wanted apostates, not martyrs. A martyr inspired others. An apostate who returned home with a sacrifice certificate was the moral defeat of the Christian movement. When all attempts at retraction failed, the magistrate handed down the sentence damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It is vital to understand that for the Roman public, the spectacle in the Colosseum was the restoration of balance. Seeing the Christian being devoured by beasts was the way the state said, "You believed your God was stronger than the laws of Rome. Here is the proof that your will means nothing before the power of Caesar." Now then, before reaching the cells of the Colosseum, high-profile Christians or those who persisted in their stubbornness were thrown into the Mamertine prison, the Tullianum. This place was not a modern prison. It was a septic tank converted into a dungeon, located in the Roman Forum. It consisted of an upper chamber and a lower chamber. The latter was accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered with ropes into absolute darkness. The air was thick, saturated by the smell of human waste and the humidity of the cloaca maxima that passed nearby. The strategy of humiliation. Rome knew that the body influences the soul. By depriving the Christian of light, basic hygiene, and space to move, they sought to strip them of their human dignity. A man who smells of excrement and has not seen the sun in weeks is in theory easier to break in front of a judge than a strong and clean man. Prison was the first step to turning the hero of faith into a frightened animal. In the solitude of these cells, the enemy was not the Roman soldier, but one's own mind. The writings of the Church Fathers and the Acts of the Martyrs describe this time as an intense spiritual battle. Often, the guards allowed family members, parents, wives, or children to enter the cells. It was not a gesture of charity, but of torture. Seeing an elderly father pleading on his knees for the son to just burn a little incense so as not to leave him alone was a psychological pressure 1,000 times stronger than the whip. In the darkness, the question arose, is it worth dying for a word? Can't I worship God in my heart and pretend to worship Caesar on the outside? Rome encouraged this doubt. The guards constantly reminded them that the world would keep turning without them, and that their sacrifice would be forgotten the day after being devoured. What transformed this experience was the community. Despite the chains, Christians turned the prison into a church. Those who showed weakness were sustained by the stronger ones. The little bread they had was shared, symbolically turning it into the Eucharist. Instead of seeing the arena as a place of execution, Christian leaders like Ignatius of Antioch began to teach their followers that they were God's wheat. They said, "I am God's wheat, and I am to be ground by the teeth of the beasts to become the clean bread of Christ." This redefinition of suffering is the key. By changing the meaning of pain, they took away Rome's power to hurt them. The beast was no longer an executioner, but the mill that prepared them for eternity. Now then, imagine the visual impact. The Colosseum was a sea of people. Chronicles tell us that the average capacity was 50,000 people. But in special events, overcrowding allowed up to 80,000 spectators. From the street, the sound was not human. It was a dull and constant roar that vibrated in the chests of the prisoners as they approached. It was the sound of the mass. Rome used this volume of people as a tool for the annihilation of the individual. How can a single man or woman maintain their faith when 50,000 voices scream for their death? The Colosseum was the ultimate test of social pressure. Upon reaching the entrance arches, the prisoners were separated from the crowd. Roman citizens entered through the 80 numbered arches using their tesserae, baked clay tickets, to find their seats. The Christians, in contrast, were led through narrow and dark passages toward the underground. This contrast is key. While the spectators ascended toward the light and air of the stands, the condemned descended toward the dampness and stench of the Hippogrium. It was a symbolic descent into hell before the final ascension, arriving at the service gates. Soldiers of the Praetorian Guard handed the prisoners over to the editors. These were not soldiers, but the organizers of the spectacle, businessmen whose only mission was for the execution to be entertaining and visually impactful. There was a cold, bureaucratic process. Each prisoner was registered. Their name, origin, and the type of assigned execution were noted. Common criminals were often forced to fight. The Christians, considered enemies of the state and atheists, were usually destined for the damnatio ad bestias, delivery to the beasts without weapons to ensure that death was a sacrifice and not a combat. Crossing the threshold of the Hippogrium, the condemned left the world of the living. This space located under the arena was not just a prison. It was a laboratory of sensory torture. The air here was thick, hot, and stagnant. The volcanic stone walls sweated moisture. And the only constant sound was the dripping of leaks and the echo of the guards' steps on the wooden grates. The design of the Hippogrium was diabolically efficient. The cells of the prisoners were located in corridors parallel to the cages of the animals. There were no solid walls, only iron bars that allowed terrifying visual and auditory contact. Lions, leopards, and bears were kept in a state of selective starvation. They were not fed so that their killing instinct would be at the surface. The prisoners spent their last hours listening to how the beasts hit the bars a few meters away, feeling the metallic smell of their breath and the stench of feline urine that penetrated to the bone. Animal handlers, the bestiari, poked the beasts with red-hot rods and pricked them through the bars so that the animal's adrenaline level would be at its maximum. The sound the Christian heard was not that of an animal in nature, but that of a tortured beast, ready to discharge its fury on the first living being it saw. Above the heads of the condemned, the world kept turning with a rhythmic violence. The roof of the Hippogrium was actually the wooden floor of the arena. Every time a pegmata elevator was activated, the sound was deafening. The screech of the bronze pulleys, the stretching of the hemp ropes, and the dry thud of the trapdoor opening functioned like a countdown clock. Prisoners could see particles of sand filtering through the cracks in the wood, falling on them as a reminder that, above, the dust was already waiting for their blood. They heard the trot of horses and the clamor of 50,000 people that sounded like distant but incessant thunder. The editors of the games sought for the execution to be a living myth. For Rome, the death of a Christian should not be solemn. It should be ridiculous. Out of pure mockery, they often forced men to wear yellow tunics, a symbol of treason, or women to be dressed as condemned mythological figures. They tried to erase their identity as servants of God, to turn them into characters of a bloody farce. They wanted that upon entering the arena. The public would not see a human being with convictions, but an object of mockery. It is in this environment designed for mental collapse where the phenomenon occurs that puzzled chroniclers like Pliny the Younger, while common criminals crawled on the floor, prayed to gods who did not respond, or fainted from terror. Christians maintained an unbreakable discipline of the spirit. In the dim light of the Hippogrium, Christians performed acts of subversive beauty. They greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek or forehead, a gesture of fraternity that declared that despite being chained, they were still a free family. Many, covered in the filth that had been thrown at them in the streets, used the little water they received, or even their own sweat, to clean their faces and fix their hair. They were not preparing for death, they were preparing for a gala. They began to intone psalms in a low voice. This singing, amidst the roar of the beasts and the noise of the machines, created an atmosphere of a cathedral in the heart of the slaughterhouse. For the Roman, dignity was lost with the uniform, the position or physical freedom. But the Christian demonstrated that true dignity is a property of the soul. By cleaning one another in the hypogeum, they were saying, Rome may decide when I die, but I decide how I die. That invisible resistance, that brightness in the eyes in the midst of mechanical darkness, was what finally broke the will of the empire. Now then, the final moment did not begin with a scream, but with a mechanical sound, the clicking of the iron latches. Prisoners were introduced into the pegmata, elevators, in that confined wooden space. The Christian remained alone or in small groups, feeling how the floor under their feet disconnected from the earth. For the team of 12 slaves operating the capstan on the lower level of the hypogeum, this was a job of brute force. But for the one inside the cage, it was an experience of deprivation and revelation. As the cage ascended through the brick shaft, the stale air of the underground was replaced by a draft of fresh air coming down from the surface. That temperature change was the physical sign that the time of waiting had ended. Upon reaching the level of the arena, the wooden trapdoor, the pegmata, opened outward. At that instant, the martyrs suffered an absolute sensory shock. After hours or days in the total darkness of the prisons and the hypogeum, the Roman sunlight hitting the white marble of the stands caused temporary blindness. But the most shocking thing was not the light, but the wall of sound. The scream of 50,000 people is not a human noise. It is a physical force that hits the chest. At that moment, the Christian found themselves in the exact center of a colosseum that demanded their destruction. Unlike the gladiators who came out showing off their weapons and seeking Caesar's gaze, the Christians walked toward the center of the ellipse with a parsimony that made the public uncomfortable. The Roman spectator attended the amphitheater under a clear psychological premise: survival at all costs. For the Roman, life was the supreme good, and the struggle was the maximum virtue. The spectacle of the Meridiani executions depended on the condemned behaving like prey. Rome needed the executed person to scream, flee, plead, or fight desperately for one more second of air. Why? Because that struggle validated Caesar's power. Seeing a man flee from a lion confirmed that the lion, and by extension, the state that controlled it, was something to be feared. The fear of the condemned was the food for the collective ego of the crowd. When the elevator stopped and the Christians stepped out into the arena, the script was broken in a resounding way. Instead of the expected hunt, a sonic void was produced. Instead of running toward the arena walls looking for a non-existent exit, the Christians stopped in the center. Many knelt, closed their eyes, or stood with arms outstretched in the shape of a cross. The posture of the orante. This lack of movement caused cognitive dissonance in the 50,000 spectators. The human brain is programmed to react to movement and conflict. When conflict disappears because one of the parties surrenders voluntarily, the crowd's adrenaline has nowhere to discharge. The scream choked in the throats of the Romans, giving way to a deathly silence charged with tension. There is a technical and moral difference between being executed and sacrificing oneself. Execution is a passive act. The state takes your life against your will. Sacrifice is an active act. You give your life for a higher purpose by kneeling. The Christian took the initiative away from the executioner. It was no longer Rome who killed them. It was they who surrendered their spirit. At that moment, the game stopped working. The spectator felt that they were no longer watching entertainment, but a liturgy. The atmosphere changed from that of a stadium to that of a temple. This role reversal made the Roman feel for the first time like an intruder in a sacred act. This sudden silence was the most dangerous moment for the empire. In the silence, man is forced to think. The Roman citizen began to question, why is he not afraid? What is it that he sees that I cannot see? Is it possible that his kingdom is more real than this marble? The lack of resistance was not weakness. It was a demonstration of spiritual authority. The Christian, in their stillness, looked more powerful than the Caesar who condemned them. While the Christians remained in the arena, praying or embracing, in a silence that defied the logic of the spectacle, all eyes turned to the imperial box. The Caesar was not just a spectator. He was the main editor, the arbiter of life and death. When the emperor considered that the psychological tension had reached its limit, he made a sign with his hand, contrary to the popular myth of the thumb down, which was usually used for gladiators, for the executions of Christians. A dry movement of the arm or a nod to the Munararius, the organizer, was enough. That signal was the order to activate the final machinery. At the moment, Caesar gave the order. The slaves in the Hippodrome pulled the release levers. Not just one door opened. The Colosseum was designed for visual impact. Suddenly, multiple trapdoors hidden in the arena floor opened simultaneously. The animals, which had been harassed with red-hot iron rods and kept in darkness and hunger for days, were propelled upward by the elevators. Upon seeing the sunlight, the beasts came out in a state of sensory frenzy. The contrast was brutal. On one side, the absolute stillness of the Christians, who often closed their eyes and continued singing in a low voice. On the other, the kinetic violence of Atlas lions, leopards, and hungry bears running through the arena, disoriented by the crowd's screams, but guided by the hunting instinct. What happened next was what most impacted the chroniclers. Many times the animals did not attack immediately. The beasts stopped before the Christians' lack of movement. In nature, a predator attacks what flees. The immobility of the martyrs confused the animal's instinct. This forced the bestiarii, the handlers, to intervene from the edges, throwing pieces of bloody meat over the Christians or using whips to urge the beasts toward them. Rome could not allow the execution to fail. The spectacle had to be completed to restore the order of the state. What the Roman chroniclers described as something amazing was the collapse of the predatory instinct. In the natural world, the hunt is a game of pursuit. The lion attacks that which runs, that which emits vibrations of panic. However, when the trapdoors opened and the Atlas lions burst into the arena, they encountered something their instinct did not know how to process. Human statues. The Christians, by remaining immobile and in prayer, did not send praise signals to the animal's brain. The confused lion often stopped a few meters away, sniffing the air, walking in circles, or even sitting down, bewildered by the lack of resistance. This silence of the beasts was the most dangerous moment for Rome's prestige. If the animal did not attack, the public began to murmur about the intervention of the gods to prevent the spectacle from turning into a visual miracle. The bestiarii intervened. These were not fighters, but technicians of terror. From the edges of the arena or protected by security bars, the bestiarii used brutal methods to force the attack. They threw pieces of raw and bloody meat directly onto the tunics of the Christians so that the smell would activate feline, ravenous hunger. They used rods with red-hot iron tips to prick the lions in the hindquarters, forcing them to jump forward out of pure pain and rage. They screamed and cracked whips to create an environment of chaos that pushed the animal to discharge its frustration on the only thing it had in front of it. Finally, instinct ended up imposing itself. The attack was not clean. It was a messy butchery that sought to destroy not only the body, but the image of peace that the martyr had built. If after the attack of the beasts, the condemned still showed signs of life, or if the agony was prolonged too long, generating uncomfortable compassion in the stands, the Roman bureaucracy sent the confector. This official was not a common executioner. He was a theater character. Often he appeared characterized as Hermes' psychopomp, Mercury, carrying a caduceus that was actually an incandescent iron rod to check if the body still reacted to pain, or as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, who, with a terrifying mask and a massive mallet, hit the skulls of the wounded to ensure an instantaneous and brutal death. Why this theater? Because for Rome, the death of the enemy of the state had to be total, definitive, and stripped of any trace of mysticism. They wanted the public's last memory to be the sound of the mallet against bone, not the sound of a psalm. Despite the bestiarii, despite the lions and Charon's mallet, Rome lost the battle of the narrative. The confector could destroy the martyr's skull, but he could not destroy the testimony of their calm. The most immediate effect of the testimony in the arena did not happen in the heavens, but in the stands. We must understand that the average Roman was an expert in death. He had attended the amphitheater for years and seen thousands of men die asking for mercy, cursing their executioners, or crying in terror. However, seeing someone die forgiving those who took their life and doing it with an inexplicable smile of peace caused a psychological short-circuit in Roman society. Many spectators returned to their homes in an unusual silence, with a stinging question hammering at their conscience. What is it that they have that I, with all my citizenship, my status, and my Roman wealth do not possess? It was the definitive clash between an empire that had everything but believed in nothing, and a group of people who had nothing but believed in everything. This phenomenon generated what we can call the echo effect. True conversion did not always happen at the moment of death, but in the days following, in the reflection of the home. The first to fall before this impact were the executioners themselves. The centurion who guarded the martyr, the gladiator who gave the coup de grace, or the guard who hours before had heard the hymns in the dim light of the hippodrome. These men, hardened in 1,000 battles, saw with amazement that the courage of the Christians was of a nature superior to the military courage of the legions. This was followed by a subversive curiosity. The people began to search for the leaders of this superstition in the shadows to understand their philosophy. They needed to know what kind of hope could make a mother guide her executioner's sword toward her own neck. That was how Tertullian's famous phrase was fulfilled. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians. For every Christian devoured in the arena, 10 more Romans began to ask about Christ. This process marked the definitive defeat of fear. Rome governed through terror. But when the people saw that this terror no longer worked with Christians, the empire's power evaporated. A system that cannot scare its subjects is a system mortally wounded. Furthermore, the testimony validated an irresistible reversal of values. It demonstrated that before God, the slave was equal to the noble in a society of rigid castes. This message of equality, sealed with life itself, was the light that the masses were waiting for. History leaves us here the triumph of truth over force. The mass conversion after the persecutions is the historical proof that physical force always loses to moral force in the long run. Rome had the legions, the gold, and the lions. The Christians only had their word and integrity. 300 years after the first Christian was thrown to the beasts, the emperor of Rome himself would end up kneeling before the cross. The Colosseum, the temple of pride and violence, was left in ruins, while the faith of those who were ground like wheat became the spiritual bread of the entire Western world. Remember that true conversion is not born of imposition, but of admiration. The world was not convinced by the speeches of Christians, but by their absolute consistency in dying. If today you want to change your environment, you do not need to shout louder than others. You need to live with such integrity that your silence is a roar in the conscience of those who observe you. With this, beloved brothers, we come to the end of this Bible study. If this video has been a blessing to your life, I invite you to like it, as that helps YouTube recommend it to more people who also need to hear and learn from the teachings of the Word of God. Likewise, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we are publishing a new video. With these words, I say goodbye for today. God bless you.